Okay, I think we're going to get started. Thank you so much to those of you here in the room and those of you watching on Zoom. Welcome to everybody to our event featuring our Beth and Arthur-led student research fellows from last summer. So before I give our land acknowledgement, which is our traditional way of opening our events, I just want to acknowledge that this is our final event of the semester for the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And I would like to thank the loyal members of our audience, both in person and on Zoom, who we see come to our events over and over again. It means a great deal to us. And I'd also like to thank the people who support our events, Patty Johnson here at Doheny Memorial Library, and especially the incredible team at Dornsife Media Services, who are always there to support us with new needs cropping up all the time. So thank you so much to all of you. So I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. And as I do, I invite those of you who are here on Zoom to let us know where you're watching from. If you've come to our events, you know that we nerd out about where people are watching from and how far our global community reaches. So please, by all means, type in the chat and let us know where you're watching from. The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva people and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamuk, Serrano, Cahuilla, Peonkuwicham, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of these lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. We invite you to read a more detailed land acknowledgement authored by the USC History Department on their website. So as we kick things off for this event, I want to explain a little bit about the format. We have two speakers today, and in a moment, Wolf will introduce our first speaker, who will give his talk, and then we will have discussion, and then the second speaker will be introduced and give their paper. So I just wanted to set the stage a little bit for how today is going to work with multiple speakers. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies, Professor of History at USC, Professor Wolf Gruner.
Thank you so much, Martha, and as always, thanks to Martha and also to Maya for organizing all these events, and this is especially important because this is kind of at the end of the semester after a really eventful series. So first, I want to briefly introduce the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, which was founded in 2014. And concentrates its effort on developing innovative and interdisciplinary research, especially regarding resistance to genocide, violence and emotions, and also digital genocide studies. The center manages a rich academic program, which consists of international conferences, workshops, event series like this, and also we are hosting numerous fellows and visiting scholars at the center to enable them to use the testimonies of the USC Shoah Foundation and also other resources relating to Holocaust and genocide studies at USC. And today's event is enabled by the Beth and Atharva Student Research Fellowship, which was endowed to especially foster research of USC students. So in comparison to almost all other fellowships we have, which are kind of a selection of international junior scholars, this one is dedicated to USC students and enables graduate students and also undergraduates to use a month in the summer in residence at the center to explore the testimonies, different testimonies collections at the USC Shoah Foundation. And we are really grateful to the donors of this fellowship. And today we feature two students at USC, Bredie and Atharva Tewari. They are the center's 2021 and 2022 Beth and Atharva Student Research Fellows. One of them is working on the Holocaust, and the other one is working on the Rohingya, the mass violence against the Rohingya. So first I start with Bredie. He recently defended his dissertation successfully at the Department of Literature and Creative Writing here at USC. He had earned his master's in English literature also here at USC, and the MFA in Literary Arts at Brown University in 2009. And before this, he was an undergraduate in philosophy at Columbia, where he earned his bachelor's. He is the author of a novel called or titled Not Constantinople, which was published already in 2017 by Tanch Book. And this novel is based on his personal experience living in Istanbul in Turkey. It was named one of the best books in 2017 by The Morning News and received praise from Viet Thanh Nguyen, T.C. Boyle, Paul Lafarge, and Amy Bender. With Joanna Howard, he is a co-translator of Frederick Boyer's Barge, which was published as Chaos by Neuengamme Press 2014. His fiction and non-fiction has been featured in various venues like the Kenyon Review, Plugshare, Guernica, The Believers, Public Books, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. He has been awarded numerous fellowships and awards, including the Tin House Winter Workshop USC Fellowship, the Gold Family Research Fellowship at the Robert Woodruff Library, Atlanta University Center in 2019, and the Edward Moses Prize in Nonfiction with an honorable mention in 2018. Please welcome Bredie.
Thank you so much, Wolf, for that kind introduction. And thank you to Martha and Maya and Atharva for sharing the stage today and for making this possible. I'm very excited to be here now, many months after our time working together last summer. So I wanted to share with you today, sort of in a 3-act structure, my project. I'll introduce the text that I'm working on, which is a novel nonfiction hybrid piece about my great aunt. Talk a little bit about her and that project, then segue into talking about the work I did in the archive, and then hopefully finish with a small excerpt of the fiction that I'm working on. So, so without further ado, the novel and nonfiction project is structured in 3 threads. One that follows my great aunt's trajectory, one that follows my family in Ecuador, and these 2 threads converge in ways which structure the novel. And then there's a 3rd thread that talks about the research and speculates about motivations, and is sort of a kind of built-in literary critical element to the book. So in the part that's germane to my time in the Shoah Foundation archive is about my great aunt. Senta Dome. So Senta Dome grew up in Hamburg as a secularized Jew. Her second marriage was to a man named Gerhard, who, having no great prospects, agreed to move to Ecuador with Senta in 1933. Senta's uncle, my great-grandfather, had a successful pharmacy business in Guayaquil, and Gerhard took a job there. But after a year giving birth to their first child, they moved back to Hamburg, having, I guess, no one knows, but not found life in Guayaquil so easy. However, the time they spent there did inspire Gerhard to go into the import-export business, specifically coffee. In 1938, Senta fled back to Guayaquil with her mother and daughter after Kristallnacht, and stayed there until mid-1939, when she returned to Hamburg. In 1945, well, I should say, in 1944, in November, she was arrested and detained at the Fußbüttel prison in Hamburg. And then in 1945, she was taken along with 70 other prisoners, her husband included, from the Fußbüttel to the Neuengamme concentration camp, where she was murdered in the waning days of the war in April. The question driving this section of the book is why she returned to Germany. And knowing the dangers she faced, having managed the kind of escape few could have managed, and I'm sure many dreamed of, why would she then, knowing that, return to a place whose perils she must have been aware of? And then also, why was she among this group of prisoners who were executed at the end of the war, which included a number of resistance members of the White Rose and the Kampf auf Fascism. So these two decisions created a kind of a theory inside my family, specifically on the part of my mother, that Senta had returned to Germany as part of a plot to distribute Ecuadorian exit visas. And for some time now, my mother and now I have been working on trying to figure out if that could be substantiated or not. Knowing that there was a substantial number of Jews who were able to flee Germany in the late 1930s using visas to Latin American countries. Latin American countries were among the last to issue exit visas, and Ecuador, I think by accident rather than design, was probably the last place that received Jewish refugees from Germany. So these two questions became the sort of facets of my research in the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. The first question, right, was about were there testimonies from survivors who had fled Germany using exit visas to Latin America, to Ecuador specifically, and was there any way to make some sort of connection between them and my great uncle? So that was one angle of my research, and then the second angle right, was to look at testimonies from survivors who had spent time in the Fußbüttel prison. This is a police prison in Hamburg. It's like a fortified prison. And whether there, in those testimonies, there was any evidence or contact with my great aunt. So those were the two sort of angles of my research in the archive, and also trying to sort of surround those questions, especially looking at for a long time, we believe that my great aunt had been among a group of prisoners who had been taken from Fußbüttel and forced marched to Lübeck, where they were placed on a prison ship, the SS Kap Akrana, that was then sunk by mistake by the RAF. So that was another narrative thread that I investigated as well. Just for the the sake of the overview of the novelistic project, another thread follows my great-great-grandfather, who was a newspaper publisher in Ecuador, who went into exile in Germany in 1922 after writing an editorial protesting the November 15th massacre of railway workers in Guayaquil, a significant event in Ecuadorian history, but not to the general course of world history, perhaps. But this did mean that he would spent at least a portion of this exile in Senta's home. His first destination was Hamburg. He was with Senta's mother, the sister of my great-grandfather. I should have probably done that. There is one at the beginning of the manuscript. It makes it a bit easier. The point being, the sort of, while correlation does not imply causation, the link between my great aunt and my great-great-grandfather may, certainly in a possible world, explain how she could have acquired something like exit visas because he held political influence in Quito. So again, the tension between what really happened and what could happen is generative in the writing of fiction. So those were the things that I went into the archive to look into. And so I spent about half my research time looking into testimonies related to the Fußbüttel prison and the forced march to Lübeck. And I came up short in terms of finding connections to my great aunt, but they were extremely moving, challenging testimonies, obviously. Many of the people who ended up in the Fußbüttel prison at that point in the war had been evacuated from work camps in Latvia and were being detained there and murdered at that sort of late stage in the war where Germany was near defeat. But even in these extreme circumstances, I did find occasions that were inspiring. There were a number of survivors who were put on a project to label bags of spices. And in this project, they were using those materials, were writing poems, which some of the survivors still had kept and exchanging them. So obviously, as I felt I was very moved that literature is still being created in this most sort of bleak of circumstances. In the other thread, in terms of looking at the survivors who used visas to Latin America, especially focusing on the kind of late period right before the war, I had a little bit more joy as a researcher in terms of finding testimonies where people there is one route to do this at this point, which was if you were able to acquire a exit visa to Latin America, and at that point there was a substantial market for these visas. So obviously some unscrupulous workers at consulates to various Latin American countries had discovered there was a market and were selling these visas. And if you could acquire one of these visas and get to Genoa, there was an Italian shipping cruise company which had two ships, Lorazzo and Virgilio, which would go from Genoa to Guayaquil and to Valparaiso, Chile. And this was one of the last routes which left Europe and directly went to the New World, and when continued running until even once the war had begun. Under the protests, the Nazi government had protested the continuing use of these ships as refugee transport, and up until the point where one of them mysteriously caught fire off the coast of Marseille, and that pretty much signaled the end of that escape route. So these testimonies were very fascinating. I have one queued up that I want to share with you just to give you a sense of the mechanics of flight and how this could work for refugees to get to Ecuador, and then I'll tell you how this sort of connects to my project. But I think Martha is going to help me show that testimony. Thank you, Martha.
Yeah.
The condition that we left Germany under was the fact that
This gentleman's name is
by
Peter Beth.
1939, my father realized that he had made a severe error in not leaving earlier. And he did tell me that in 1936, my grandfather called his two sons together and advised them to leave Germany immediately. He felt that he did not think that things were going to get any better, and he said, I recommend that you leave immediately. My uncle, who was single, took my grandfather's advice and immediately packed up and left and went to Sydney, Australia. My father, who had me, I was 1 year old, and we were married and things were going quite well, decided that he would wait it out. And then as things became worse and worse and worse, it was almost impossible to get a exit visa. And the reason that it was impossible to get an exit visa was that the Nazis said that you could only get an exit visa if you had an entry visa from another country. And you had to present the entry visa at the time you asked for the exit visa. And if you didn't have a valid entry visa to that country, you couldn't get an exit visa. Well, in 1938 and 1939, there was a tremendous effort to try to get entry visas from Palestine, from England, And many countries, particularly Palestine, got to a point where they said that if you had a particular skill, then they would give you an entry visa because they were looking for electricians or carpenters or so on and so forth. But if you didn't, then it was a long time coming in trying to get a entry visa. So my father was desperate, and he had a friend in the Argentinian embassy who called him up and told him that the ambassador was leaving for several days from Berlin, and that he could give my father fake entry visas to Argentina, but that if the Nazis called to verify them, that he would answer the phone only through Sunday night, and then the ambassador would return, so that if he couldn't get an exit visa in a very short time with these fake entry visas, then that was it. So my father...
Do you know the name of that man?
No,
who
I
helped
don't.
you?
I don't. I wish I did. I don't. And my father took these entry visas on a Friday, and he went down to the local area where the Nazis were issuing these exit visas. And there was a long, long line of people, and he was in the line, and the line wasn't moving very fast, and the Nazis were taking their time. They weren't in any hurry. And then he found out that they were not going to be open on Saturday. So it was Friday or nothing. And he had this long line, and he decided that he was in line to get this exit visa, and if he didn't get it now, he'd never get it. So he took this card that he had in his pocket for winning the Iron Cross First Class, and he decided that he would walk up to the desk where this SS major was in charge issuing these exit visas, and he put his card down in front of the major and said to him, "I demand service." And the major looked at him, he looked at his card, and he said, "What is it you want?" He said, "I want 3 exit visas now." The major gave him 3 exit visas, saluted him, gave him back his card. That night we were out of Berlin on an airplane. And as he said to my wife, as I told you, he told this story to my wife, if he hadn't gotten that, we would have been stuck in Berlin, and we would not have been there very long. And so he just decided, well, either way, either they're going to shoot me for doing what I'm doing, or it'll work and we'll be out, or I'm dead anyhow. So that's what he did, and that's how we got out. And just as an aside, several years later when we were in New York, I was going to public school in Washington Heights, and in 1942, the school I was attending, which was PS 173, was having a scrap drive to support the war. And I went home and I told my dad that, you know, I was collecting cans and stuff that everybody was doing for the scrap drive. And as I left that morning to go to school, he gave me an envelope and he said, "Here, contribute this to the scrap drive when you get to your class." And I brought in my cans, and then I gave the teacher the envelope, and I said, "My father sent this for the scrap drive." And opened the envelope, it was all his German medals. And he had donated it to the scrap drive.
I'll stop there. I like the way that ends. But needless to say, Peter Beck then traveled to Guayaquil, where actually he was detained with his family because those exit visas were fake, but did eventually make it to New York City and survive. There are a number of stories like this. You know, the extreme contingency of this means of escape, meant that it was truly last minute high stakes, and the many of the testimonies had the same kind of one favorable look from a border guard, or a horrible fate. So this connects to my great aunt's story, because in the family tellings of her life and ultimate fate, it was always noted that she took an Italian ship back to Germany from Guayaquil, and nobody really knew what the story was there. And I was able to sort of triangulate that it must have been one of these two ships, the Orazio and the Virgilio, which, for me at least, as a fiction writer rather than a researcher, connected her to this visa and escape scheme, which again is not correlation, does not necessarily imply causation. And there are a number of other details without venturing farther from the research I did in the Visual History Archive that indicate other reasons that the book explores, especially, and I'd like to acknowledge too that a lot of that research was assisted and performed by one of the Schlopperstein researchers. Sorry, my German pronunciation's horrible. Stumbling Stone project named Johannes Grossman. So it's appropriate to acknowledge that. So how did this, my time in the archive, shape my fiction? I should just, how much time do I have left?
It's almost over, yeah.
Okay, well, then I will spare you reading an excerpt of this work in progress, and probably spare myself, thankfully. But this it allowed me through these testimonies to visualize a lot about what life in Hamburg was like for at that time, but also what this journey must have been like from Genoa to Guayaquil, and the sort of mechanisms of the sort of last minute escapes using visas to Latin America. So for that, I was very grateful as an artist, and also maintain an interest in this particular area of Holocaust studies. So I hope to have an opportunity to do more research in it, both for the book and as a scholar. So I'll leave it there. And thank you again for giving me this forum.
I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. If you on Zoom have questions, please type them into the chat or the Q&A feature at the bottom, and my colleague Maya will relay your questions. What about here in the room? Any questions to start with? Silence.
Yeah. So you mentioned several times. First of all, thank you very much, and I really like that this inspires kind of future novel, and so that's really wonderful. So you talked several times about that they return to Hamburg. So did your research kind of get you any closer in understanding why they did? And
sort of. So I think because Senta was technically, and my eugenics is a little rusty, a Mischling of the second class, meant that in 1939 she had reason to believe that she was still a German citizen. At the same time, her husband was a member of the Nazi Party. And so I have to imagine, and this is one way, so the book entertains a number of possible stories, and that's in part why it has a non-fictional element. That, one possibility is that she simply thought that she would be safe, and that whatever happened, at that point, the coffee company that they owned was fairly successful. It was, had factories in Hamburg and Lübeck, and so they were had gone from being fairly lower class to being, looking like they would have a middle class lifestyle.
I have a question from the chat from Sibel. How many testimonies did you investigate? What keywords did you use?
A lot. Easily hundreds. As I said, I kind of went through two phases. One that focused on Fußbüttel, Neuengamme, the Bay of Lübeck, and the Kappa Krona. And then I sort of shifted gears and looked for people who had ended, testimonies. There's a geographic feature, right? So that involved Ecuador or Chile, involved those ships that I mentioned. Those are actually, once I isolated that, a really interesting way of searching. The archive has a lot of really interesting specific keywords, things like particular ships that, really, suddenly you get a picture of all these different people whose lives intertwine because they were all on the same, form of transport and escaping. So the answer is many, but the archive is really well organized through keyword. Also, to look at people who had similar birth dates to my great aunt, and that was in some ways research for color. Let's say, like just people who had grown up in Hamburg around the same time that she did.
So in your talk, you made a distinction between yourself as a writer and yourself as a researcher. You kind of said, I'm not a researcher, I'm a writer. And, so I'm wondering, just from working with this kind of archive and hearing actual, personal histories of what happened, how do you think that would affect your writing if you were writing stories even closer to the experiences that you heard? And I'm talking about what are the limits or the shape of the artistic license that you as a writer might bring to the stories that you listen to?
I mean, I feel a fairly heavy responsibility in terms of the idea of using testimonies in an artistic or imaginative project. I think in part that's why this particular project has a almost a designated thread that is presented as nonfiction and in some ways serves as a check on the narrative. As a writer, I'm obviously somebody who loves narrative, but I'm also extremely skeptical of it. And the draw or the attraction or the desire to for narratives that are validating for readers. This is not, if you want to be an extremely well-selling novelist, this is not a good impulse, but it is mine. Yeah, I have an interest in maintaining, perhaps at the detriment of narrative, or let's say to let narrative be narrative, but also to force readers to confront the desire behind that.
No, you go.
I was wondering if in your research, in your personal research in the archives, and also the research that you said you're doing with your mother, if you found anything related to how they experienced the journey and how it was coming to Ecuador, and how was the Jewish community there, and yeah.
Yeah, well, so my great-grandfather won a grant to pasteurize milk in Guayaquil. So he came from Hamburg substantially earlier, in the late 1890s. There was after the war, there's a substantial Jewish community, mostly in Quito, rather than Guayaquil. Much of that community, and this is a whole other and very interesting story, dispersed in the 50s and 60s. So, but my great-grandfather became a Catholic and married an Ecuadoriana, and there was sort of crypto Judaism practice in the house. It was never really explicit because Ecuador, like much of the world, has a serious anti-Semitic problem.
Did you want to ask one final question?
Yeah, thank you. So, when many in the testimonies, many survivors talk about their luck or contingencies and coincidences. The story you told was less so a coincidence. Somebody acted kind of in a proactive way. Did you come across in your research in the archive kind of about more of these instances where people created opportunities for themselves rather than being kind of a victim of coincidences?
So, like the testimony I showed, would that be a coincidence or
So when the story where a man went up to the front and with the medal and said,
Yeah.
I want these visas, that's acting proactively, because if he would have waited, he may have never gotten it, right? So many Jews acted in a proactive manner. And that's what I'm asking. Did you come across other similar stories?
Oh, yes, certainly. I didn't mean to say that it is all, I mean, the intention, and I wrote a small piece on this as part of my fellowship. One of the search terms is called flight decisions. And this became something that I became fixated on. Again, as a novelist, decisions are what make prose fiction. And so the combination of people's resolve to leave, when they resolve to do it, how they did it, but is a driving force. So no, I don't mean to say that it's all contingency, but then there are always these at the same time. And again, this is maybe a novelist's eye that drives it. That he did go up there, but to demand these exit visas, but he also happened to have this. What if he hadn't had this Iron Cross certification? Right, and where would he be then? So there's also the consideration of not just the action on the part of the individual, but also sort of what if. That again, from a narrative standpoint, we can't help but be interested.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
So thank you, Nicholas, and I'm introducing now Atharva Tewari, who's currently a junior at the University of Southern California. He's majoring in global studies and journalism with a research focus on South and Southeast Asia. His research draws on his global studies coursework, journalistic and ethnographic training, and builds on his experience and interest in working with refugees. He is currently researching for his thesis in ethnography of support staff within the university, trying to answer questions of invisible and visible labor. He is the co-founder and editor of the USC Student Journal for Asian Studies, an interdisciplinary research journal sponsored by the East Asia Studies Center. He is currently a collections and dimensions in testimony intern at the USC Shoah Foundation and a volunteer archivist at the One Archives at the USC Libraries. He co-founded the Partitioning Chinyot project to document the stories of generations of families who hailed from Chinyot in Pakistan and were forced to flee their hometown during the partition of India and who settled throughout India. And the narratives of these refugees will be compiled into a book as part of the larger project situated in India. So without further ado, welcome Atharva.
Hi everyone, my name is Atharva Tewari, and I had the privilege of being the Beth and Arthur Love Fellow for the summer of 2021.
You can take it off
Okay.
if you want.
Summer of 2021. Through the Visual History Archive, I was able to gain access to the testimonies of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh who were fleeing violence and ethnic cleansing in neighboring Burma in 2017. What I'm presenting today is a compilation of my meandering thoughts and academic musings while watching these testimonies. This is also my first academic lecture, and I'm an undergraduate student, so I ask for your patience. And I'm also not a very good public speaker, but we're going to do this. So this lecture today is called Rohingya Not Bengali, Citizenship and Belonging from a Distance. So since I was the first ever scholar to work and watch these testimonies, this particular set of testimonies, I did take it upon myself to give a little bit of historical background and politically and historically contextualize the persecution of the Rohingyas. These historical and political narratives kind of became crucial to my reading of the situation of the Rohingyas, and also in grounding some of the unexpected and surprising things that I was finding and hearing while watching these testimonies. So who are the Rohingyas? What is their relationship with the Burmese state? And how did they come to be the targets of one of the worst ethnic cleansings of the century? So this slide kind of provides some basic background information to acquaint you with the Rohingya people. As we all know, Burma is a Buddhist majority state where the Burma people are the ethnic majority. However, it's on the peripheries of the state where the ethnic minorities like the Karen, Chin, Shan, and the Rohingya people live. Rohingyas are ethnically Muslim and primarily live in Rakhine state. And their first language is not Burmese, it's actually a dialect of Bengali that is called Chittagong Bengali. And their population before the violence in 2017 is estimated to be around 1.7 million in Burma. So for regular folks who might not be much acquainted with the history of South and Southeast Asia, might view the Rohingya problem as a rather contemporary one. So around 2016-17 when it starts making the headlines in Western media. But however, the persecution of the Rohingyas kind of traces back centuries and has been multi-pronged in the way that their persecutors have changed historically, but the violence, betrayal, and disenfranchisement has continued. This slide provides quite a brief, and some will say reductive, breakdown of how history has just continuously not been kind to the Rohingyas. So it starts in 1784 with the Burmese king Bodapaya conquering the kingdom Arakan and driving out much of the Rohingyas to what now is Bangladeshi territory. But skipping over a few hundred years, in 1945, there's a Japanese occupation of Burma, and the Britishers are very desperate to get back control. So they recruit the Arakan people, who are also like Rohingyas can also be called Arakan people because they live in the Arakan mountains in Burma. So they recruit them to help get defeat the Japanese occupation. And in return, they promise a Muslim state. And as always, the English don't deliver, as is their history in the subcontinent. So next, Burma gains independence in 1948, and the Union Citizenship Act is passed. And Rohingyas don't get, they get excluded from that, but also they're able to get nationality cards by providing ancestral heritage papers and providing paperwork to the government. And in 1962, the first ever military coup happens in Burma, first of many for those who know Burma's history. And General Neuengamme starts cracking down on Rohingya political activity and intellectuals. The final blow, however, comes in 1982 with the official passage of the 1983 Burma Citizenship Act that actually did recognize 135 races in Burma, but strategically excluded the Rohingyas, thus rendering them stateless. So now to the discourse that I and many others deem central to understanding the situation that the Rohingyas find themselves in, is this discourse of Rohingya versus Bengali. The Burmese government, society, and media uses the word Bengali to describe the Rohingyas as they see them as not legitimate citizens and stakeholders in the post-colonial state, but as illegal migrants who came in from Bangladesh during the colonial period when Burma was actually administered as a province of British India. So migration was deemed internal and it was not regulated. The usage of the word Bengali is used as an erasive tool against the Rohingya identity and to deny Rohingya's centuries-long presence in Burmese territory. So coming to 2017, when the violence that these refugees were fleeing happened. So what really happened in 2017? According to the Burmese government, Rohingya insurgents attacked 30 military posts in Rakhine State in August. In response, the military and also Buddhist nationalist groups backed by the military attacked and razed Rohingya villages. Widespread reports of sexual assault, mass killings of Rohingya civilians was reported in Rakhine State. In 2017 alone, 700,000 Rohingyas fled Burma to Bangladesh, and 500,000 still remain in Rakhine State, majority of whom are now internally displaced. I found this graphic by Al Jazeera that helps you kind of visualize where the Rohingyas have immigrated and fled to since the 1970s. Since the 1970s, over 1 million Rohingyas have managed to eventually immigrate to different parts of the world. And as you can see, they're kind of now spread all over like South Asia, Southeast Asia, and also the Middle East. So now on to what I did over the summer. I reviewed the 11 testimonies that were available to me through the Visual History Archive, and these were all Rohingya refugees living in Cox's Bazar. So all of them did cross over into Bangladesh after the violence unleashed by the military in between August and October of 2017. I also reviewed academic and journalistic literature about the Rohingya history in the subcontinent, and also about the ongoing discourse of the usage of the word Rohingya and Bengali as a social and political label. So this part becomes kind of the foundation of what I just presented you with. So now to the questions that I was kind of coming up with when I was reviewing literature and also while watching these testimonies. So they kind of become the basis of my research. So the first is about language of identification. How is the discourse and distinction between Bengali and Rohingya being lived and experienced by these Rohingya refugees? And also, what does it mean for these refugees to belong and lay claims to a state whose entire project is their elimination? So I have picked some quotes from testimonies that speak to the questions that I just posed. So the first is Shafiqa Begum. When asked about returning to Burma, she says, they need to give us cards that say Rohingya. They were giving us cards that say that we are not from this country. We were not born in this country. Our father was born here. We were born here. It is our birthright. We did not inherit it. First, they have to give us Rohingya card like they give to the people in Bangladesh. And to here, she's referring to the citizenship cards that regular citizens of Bangladesh get. And then she goes on to say, to the Burmese people, we are a different ethnicity, but aren't we the same nationality? So in Shafiqa's testimony, you see this clear assertion of her Rohingya identity that is not only based on rejecting the Bengali/alien label being imposed on her and her people by the state, but also it is equally reliant on the claim that she's making to the Burmese state. She's engendering a belonging in the face of violence to say that she too is indigenous to the country by invoking her ancestral heritage. The second quote to me spoke about how being Rohingya is, yes, about rejecting this Bengali label, but it's also about making a strong claim to a Burmese citizenship and nationality. The insistence to belong to a state that doesn't see you as its own, that for Shafiqa, raped her, killed her family members, decimated the life as she knew it, and then drove her out. Nur Sahar kept emphasizing the same thing, the importance of nationality cards to enable a solid rejection of the Bengali category and the official recognition of Rohingya as their own race. She says, if we get cards as citizens, which we will be able to hang on our neck, if we get that card, which has been our ancestors, we won't even need rations in the country. And then she talks about the bullying that she faced. They bully us as Bengali. We are a race that they try to demolish and forget the Rohingya. They try to make us Bengali, though we are not. For Nur Sahar, the official recognition of her Burmese citizenship is more crucial than even necessities like food. She sees the acquisition of the citizenship as the end goal and an all-encompassing solution to the problems faced by her and her community. So the problem of paperwork might not seem as immediate, but for the Rohingya, it has been so viscerally lived through and experienced throughout decades that it triumphs other material struggles that they might be facing, like housing crisis, poverty, the problem with like food and nutrition. Abdul Karim is relatively young. When asked about the message he wants to send out to the world at the end of his interview, says that the first and most important thing is to recognize us as Rohingyas. World leaders need to recognize us as Rohingya. They, meaning the Burmese government, must allow us to hold government jobs like everyone else. So again, we see how omnipresent the issue of labeling and recognition is for these people. The recognition of the Rohingya as a legitimate subgroup as citizens of Burma becomes absolutely crucial. Another surprising answer that emerges in this testimony and others is that there exists not just an insistence on going back, on imagining a future within the borders of Burma as legitimate citizens, but also a willingness and eagerness almost to become involved in the everyday functioning of the state as civil servants and in governmental positions, to be agents of the state who reproduce its presence even after everything that it has put them through, not only extending claims to citizenship and legitimate belonging, but also imagining a return that is characterized by involvement and participation in state machinery. Haji Oliullah is the son of an imam. He's quite educated and hence was persecuted as an intellectual and a middle-class Rohingya citizen in Rakhine State. When asked at the end of his interview if he would go back, he answers without skipping a beat. Why wouldn't I go back to my country? I'll go back to my country if I could this evening. After hearing this, the interviewer is audibly surprised and asks him why he would go back even after everything that has happened. To which he says, whatever has happened, but it is his country and he wants to go back. Now for the last testimony I pulled quotes from was this woman named Jamila Khatun. This is her third time being a refugee in Bangladesh, and she has again suffered unimaginable horrors. She's lost offspring, her family members, just overall lived a life in continuous uncertainty and precarity. When asked if she wants to go back, she answers, we all want to go back to our country, hope our children can work in government office. We can do so if they can accept us as Rohingya. So even here, you see this woman who has essentially been expelled by the state 3 times in her life, lost so much, expressing a willingness not just to go back to her country, to imagine a future within the borders of Burma where her offsprings are employed by the state and again, part of its everyday functioning. So before I conclude, I just want to acknowledge the limits of my research. I was only able to look at the 11 testimonies that were available to me through the Visual History Archive, and my analysis is my own. And there are many ways you can read these testimonies, statements, and experiences. But here is what I think. After decades of the Burmese military and political establishment imposing the identity of Bengali on them and trying to send them back to where they came from, that is in the state-sized Bangladesh, an important aspect of the Rohingya identity has become not being Bengali, moving away and disparaging this label as it not only denies their indigeneity to Burma and also disappears that existence as a distinct ethnicity. Hence, you see this continued insistence on the part of the refugees on establishing a distance between themselves and this label Bengali. But being Rohingya is also equally about being Burmese and a Burmese citizen. This eagerness and insistence to go back to Burma, even after everything that's happened, is about not letting the state win or having its fantasized project be complete. Because the state did drive them out. In its eyes, it did send them back to where they came from, that is Bangladesh. And after decades of inflicting this label of Bengali on them, the state did materialize it by driving them out. So this conflict is very much about the physical, bodily, and tangible violence inflicted by the Burmese state on Rohingya bodies in its process of apparent state building. But it's also about narrative and counter-narratives. It is about Rohingya versus Bengali. So these thoroughly disenfranchised, persecuted people still lay claims to the nation state of Burma, referring it to as our country, imagining a future within the borders of a state that has never wanted them and still doesn't want them or see them as rightful citizens. That is the project of diaspora after all, isn't it? Imagining a homeland that doesn't exist, and in the case of these refugees, doesn't want them, has never wanted them. The things that they lay claim on don't exist anymore. These villages, their villages, their mosques have been burned down, the people they knew have been killed, their cattle has been taken away or killed. As one survivor described in his testimony, looking at the villages being burned down and people being killed that he saw as he was escaping, he says, "It's almost like we didn't exist. Everything was gone." They lay claims, imagine a future where they receive recognition and are even able to participate in the same process of state building and functioning that led to their persecution. They imagine a belonging because if they don't, the state wins. Then they become Bengalis in Bangladesh. I wanted to do a brief acknowledgement at the end. This is my first academic talk, and I wanted to dedicate it to my grandfather who passed away last April due to COVID-19, just a few days before I submitted the proposal for this fellowship. I wanted to thank Dr. Janet Hoskins, my mentor and professor who introduced me to the discipline of anthropology and has been a great supporter since of my academic endeavors. Next, I want to thank Dr. Martha Stroud, Associate Director of the Center, who despite having faced personal hardship for the past year, has been a great mentor and listened to my musings about testimonies with extreme patience. I also want to thank Dr. Wolf Brunner, who was kind enough to meet with me over the summer despite the bizarre time difference, and also for forwarding me the literature that helped me start thinking about the research questions that are still very foundational to my ongoing research. And thank you all for being here and listening so patiently.
All right, again, I open the floor up for questions, including those of you joining us on Zoom. I'm going to go over here now and stop the screen
Go
share.
easy on me. Yes.
I start with an easy question. Can you describe a little bit how did you become interested in this topic?
Okay, so for me, it started with in senior year of high school because I was doing a senior thesis for my political science class. And I feel like for me, it's always any kind of research I do has to be connected with people. So people were, in my political science class theorizing about international theories and, I don't know, Kant or something, I don't know. But I was like, I want to do something with people. And in 2016-17, we did start receiving a lot of Rohingya refugees in India. So I was very interested in that issue from the beginning. And I was like, okay, I kind of want to do an ethnographic project. So I started volunteering with them at this makeshift camp. It wasn't anything official, it was just this makeshift camp. I was basically just teaching the children who were fresh arriving because we didn't want them to get behind in their education. And I started with that, and then I took the class, I think, and then I wrote that senior thesis. And then I come to USC and I took a class about Southeast Asia with Dr. Janet Hoskins, and that's where I became interested again. And then I'm also just generally very interested in Burma. I've done a lot of journalistic work on Burma, especially in the last year when the coup happened. And then this fellowship came to be, and I was like, okay, I get to continue the work that I love. Yeah.
I hope this is an easy laugh. I was wondering within those 11 video testimonies, if you could talk a little bit more about the demographics of the individuals, as well as if you found any particular identity categories playing out more in, for example, like if gender or age, if that was an impact on these testimonies?
I think most of them were Rohingya, like these are Rohingya testimonies, so they were Rohingya. I think it was pretty evenly spread in terms of gender, just like, the 11 that we had in the archive. But I like this question because, okay, so when I was, so this is kind of what I'm trying to do in the future, like languages of self-identification, especially by refugees. I'm trying to kind of do a comparative project with like Bangladesh and like India, which is like, a Hindu nationalist government versus like Bangladesh, which is a Muslim country. So how I talked about them rejecting this Bengali label over and over again, and they're like, we're not Bengali, we're not Bangladeshi. But they do kind of, you have to survive. You have to gain some sort of mobility in these refugee camps. You do what you can. You kind of like the practice of flexible essentialism, right? You like strategically essentialize your own identity to gain mobility. So these refugees did emphasize a lot of, because they're in Bangladesh, living under a Bangladeshi regime, they do emphasize their identities as Muslims. That becomes very, very apparent. They're like, we're Muslims, so this government must help us. And when they're talking about in the context of, this is a quote that still stands out to me, it's not in the presentation. Actually, I think it was Haji Uliullah, who was the son of the Imam. And when he's addressing, when he's asked to address like Western countries and Western leaders, he says, they must help us despite the fact that we're Muslims. So you see this change in like, what part of your identity do you essentialize? What way do you present it? Depending on who you're addressing. So in an Islamic state like Bangladesh, like you kind of harden and temper your, subjectivity as a Muslim. And then when you're addressing the Western leaders, you're like, help us, even though we're Muslim. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.
Go. I see you raising your hand.
So in the beginning, you showed this kind of table with the exclusion acts. So I wonder if you could get some information from the testimonies about how people reacted or responded or even resisted towards these exclusionary acts. So the early one in the 1940s, 50s, and then the 1982, I think, right? So were there efforts, individual or collective, to kind of counter these exclusionary acts?
I think there wasn't that much of a problem with the first one because it did like officially didn't mention them, but they were able to like, they were given the option of providing ancestral papers and stuff to prove. So that's not where I think the problem with paperwork began. I think it becomes really apparent in like 1982. That's kind of the breaking point. Before that, they had like nationality cards. I think that the difference becomes like, do they have like citizenship cards versus nationality cards? But nationality cards like kind of guaranteed them like full rights, or they were like able to, they had the freedom of movement and the discrimination wasn't as bad. But in 1982, when it gets really bad, because then they, not only do they say that we will not issue like, citizenship will not recognize you, they also start coming in and there's like accounts of this, people remembering the military starts coming in and taking back those cards and then giving them. I think it's in one of the testimonies that I shared where she's saying that, they were giving us cards that say Bengali and not Rohingya. They were giving us cards that say that we're not citizens of this country. And in terms of resistance, I think there's a slide in here that I pulled two pictures because people, it's interesting when these people fled, they saved a lot of the identification cards that they had. So in the VHA, you'll find like, someone did take the time to like take pictures of those cards and I put them in one of the slides on the side. But some of these people did happen to like, they couldn't do much about the state machinery and the apparatus. They couldn't like, go and change the act itself, but they did. So the military was coming in, taking back their nationality cards. Some of them still have them. They managed to keep it. So they still have those like records that, that parents say, they say of the official like recognition that they receive from the government and which is not issued anymore. So they did save that, but I don't know like any other accounts of like where they're actually able to like resist because again, the military is like all pervasive. They do come in, they like, there are accounts where like they do like an annual census. So everyone has to stand in line with their cards, and I think they charge a certain amount in Burmese for like each new member. Because another project of the military and the Burmese regime is like population control. So they'll charge you more every year when you kind of stand in line, and if there's a new member, they'll charge you money to include them in the census. So yeah, I think it's very hard to it's just amazing to see that they're even able to save these papers, because the military comes in and just takes it, and there's annual records and census. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So I have a question that kind of builds off of Wolf's question, which is, for most scholars who've worked with the BHA and worked with the Holocaust testimonies, we have a certain conception of what a testimony is. Someone is sitting in their living room, there's a piece of art behind them, maybe there are flowers in the frame next to them, and they tell a story guided by an interviewer of their lives before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, after the Holocaust, their hopes for the future, their message to subsequent generations. And I think one of the exciting things about having you work with these testimonies, including potentially some of the ones that aren't in the VHA yet, is for you to fill in the picture for us of what testimonies in the VHA look like. Are people in these interviews talking about their past 40 years ago, or are they talking about, what has just occurred, where they came from, what they saw, in the immediate past?
I think that's a really good question. It kind of speaks to the struggle that I was having when I was typing the talk, because this was not my first choice that I ended up going with. It was actually called Rohingya Citizenship and Identity in Flux, and influx becoming kind of the focal point, because you watch these testimonies, and as Martha said so beautifully, that testimony, especially in relation to the Holocaust, it's kind of in the past it happened, and then now survivors are living across the world, and what Holocaust testimonies, the way that they play out normally. And with these testimonies, it's just happened. These people just escaped. It's so immediate. It's so their identities, their emotions are so in flux. So, there's a good chance that, what I try to theorize through these testimonies is not true anymore, because these testimonies were immediately after the violence happened. And yeah, I don't think there's that much of there's not that much of a retrospective, I don't know, thinking happening with the refugees. It's very much about the present. And I think the way that these interviews were structured, right? That's something that Martha and I talked about over the summer, that they're very much about what happened in 2017 and the aftermath. So every story that they tell, so even the stories that they tell with fondness are of back in our parents' day, we had these cards and we had rights. So it's very much centered around that. But yeah, so I think also, I'm trying to think about testimonies, because I did have a lot of thoughts when I was watching these testimonies. Another thing is it tells you a lot about I don't know, cultural family dynamics too, because these people are living in refugee camps. So a lot can be learned, because if you're watching a Holocaust testimony in someone's drawing room, you're kind of just focusing on the person and what they're saying. And there's not that much going on in the background. The interview with these interviews, because it's in a refugee camp, which is a very volatile situation, there's so much going on. So they'll sometimes get derailed, and sometimes getting derailed during that interview is actually a good thing, because when the interviewer is so laser focused, I mean, I'm not criticizing the interviewer, very, very good interviews, but when they're so laser focused and kind of becomes derailed, so you learn about the children. So I think one of the interviews, the children kind of, the child is sitting behind a screen, he kind of crawls out, and then the father turns on, is go back inside, and then he starts talking about his son and why he's doing that. And then his wife kind of comes into the frame, and then they start talking about the wife. So it's very meandering when testimonies are done in refugee camps. And I think another aspect that I thought a lot about is how do you define consent in testimonies that are filmed in refugee camps? Because again, if someone walks by or someone kind of chimes in, because there are testimonies where you see two people in the frame and it's just one person getting interviewed, but then they kind of forget something and the other person fills in, or they kind of take over. So how do you define consent and like, I don't know, copyright in that situation? So yeah, I think that's a very good question. And that's something that I personally struggle with a lot while watching these testimonies, because it kind of changes, because I do work with the Shoah Foundation. I worked with Holocaust testimonies on filming and producing with the DIT program. And it's just so different because with the Holocaust, we have like, this privilege that it happened in the past. So we can kind of, take the time to like produce and like stage testimonies and produce content in a way which is like educational and like very linear, but for the sake of like our understanding. But with these, I think it's just a whole different game.
Any other questions? No, want to wrap it up? All right.